Hi students, in this part we'll be talking about sleep and memory and the midbrain or the brainstem and as a whole. And we'll start off with the hemisphere dominance. So we do know that we have a right and a left hemisphere, but one of them is dominant, and that is the left is the one that's dominant in most individuals, meaning that there are centers that work on the left side but not on the right side. For example, Wernicke's and Broca's areas in left dominant hemisphere individuals, these centers are functioning on the left but are not on the right, which means that if somebody gets a stroke on the left side, they would lose these areas, and then speech therapists would have to teach the patient in order to revive those centers that are on the right. The dominant hemisphere controls the left side of the left side of the brain is the one that is more into math skills, analysis, computational skills, which are your math skills again, language, speech, and writing. While the non-dominant hemisphere, that is more responsible like for the arts, like understanding and interpreting musical and visual patterns, emotions and intuitions, the non-verbal tasks, and motor tasks. For memory, there are two different kinds of memory. The first one is the short-term memory, and the second one is long-term. So when we're learning something for the very first time, it gets into our short-term memory. And then we have these neurons that are connected in a circuit that keep reminding us of that short-term memory. So think of that kindergartner learning the alphabet for the first time. What does their environment look like? So they have a teacher that is teaching them that this is what an A looks like, and then everywhere they look in that classroom, there are all of these posters, there are puzzles and all these games that show the letter A, and this is how it's pronounced, and so on. So all of these little cues are creating those circuits in their brain in order to remember that this is the letter A, until it actually gets engraved into their brains, where we increase the number of dendrites of the neurons, and those dendrites start to branch out and synapse with their surrounding neurons. And that means that we have changed that short-term memory into a long-term memory. So now that kid automatically, when they see an A, they recognize it, they're able to pronounce it, and they start learning how to read and write. So the whole process of learning is really going from that circuit of constantly reminding ourselves of the information, whether it's through reading or doing assignments or whatever repetition works for us, in order to consolidate them into a long-term memory. And that again means that you have literally changed the structure of the neurons. So you've increased your dendrite numbers, increased the connections between the neurons, which means you've enhanced that synaptic transmission. The basal nuclei are a collection of cell bodies that are found embedded within the depth of the brain. And sometimes they're called basal ganglia, but the correct term is nuclei. So a collection of cell bodies in the peripheral nervous system is known as a ganglia, while the collection of cell bodies in the CNS is known as nuclei or a nucleus. So these right here, because they're embedded within the cerebrum, those are correctly known as basal nuclei. We have the three of them, or there's more, but we need to know three of them: the caudate nucleus, putamen, and the globus pallidus. Those produce dopamine, and they help in controlling of voluntary movements. So they do not initiate your voluntary movement. Your voluntary movements are initiated by the prefrontal gyrus in the frontal lobe. But these control voluntary movements, meaning that they make these movements smoother. Okay, so if that prefrontal cortex is sending, say, 1 million signals to your muscles to contract, that means that our movements would be very rigid, would be very sudden, and it's up to these basal nuclei to filter the extras out. So at the end of the day, our skeletal muscles are getting maybe only 1,000 orders to contract, and the rest are being filtered, and that would be thanks to these basal nuclei. So again, they help in controlling voluntary movement, giving us this very smooth kind of movement that is well constructed and well controlled. When patients lose the function of the basal nuclei due to the loss of dopamine, dopamine is actually not only made by the basal nuclei, but it's also made by another nucleus found in the brain, and it's known as the substantia nigra. And when there is the loss or the degeneration of that, it leads to the loss of dopamine. Now, dopamine, again, remember, we said is responsible for the neurotransmission and that is needed by the basal nuclei. Now that you've lost that function, you're no longer filtering out all of those extra motor impulses, and that leads to, you want to think of Muhammad Ali and Michael J. Fox. So they both have Parkinsonism, and they have lost they're more have this like mask-like face. They've got tremors, a shuffling gait, meaning that the steps are very small. There's rigidity in the muscles because, again, now their muscles are getting all of the extra orders for contraction. It's very hard for them to control their fine motor movements, so they have this very small handwriting, speech difficulties, and mask-like face. And what is really very diagnostic for Parkinsonism is the mask-like face. When these patients are speaking, they don't have the facial expressions or unable to perform all of these facial expressions. Unfortunately, there's no real treatment for PD. It's more like how to decrease the symptoms, where the patients are given levodopa or L-dopa, and that is a dopamine precursor, meaning that in the body it is going to change into dopamine, cross the blood-brain barrier, and hopefully help in decreasing the symptoms. The cause of PD is really not known. Sometimes it tends to run in families, so there is a genetic component to it, but the most common things associated with them are certain drugs, pesticide exposure, and frequent blows to the head. So again, think of Muhammad Ali getting all of these blows to the head while he was boxing, and then later on in life he developed Parkinsonism. Now, the diencephalon, those are the parts that are found under the cerebral cortex and above the brainstem. Okay, these are made of lots of different structures collected together, and we name them collectively as the diencephalon. We want to know the different parts, so we've got the thalamus and hypothalamus, the posterior pituitary, and the infundibulum. The infundibulum connects the hypothalamus to the posterior pituitary. And when we talk in the endocrine system, we'll find out that the hypothalamus makes hormones. Some of its hormones are stored in the posterior pituitary and then released from there. Okay, in order for these hormones to go from the hypothalamus to be stored in the posterior pituitary, that would go through the infundibulum. So it's kind of like a little stem or tube connecting these two structures together. There is the optic chiasm and the optic tract, and those are parts of the visual pathway. So how vision would reach the cerebral cortex. There's a mammillary body, or mammillary bodies, and we have the pineal gland. The pineal gland is a gland that makes, you can see it here from the back, that makes melatonin, which is responsible for the circadian rhythm, or that 24-hour rhythm biological clock. We're not going to learn about all of the structures, the important ones, so the thalamus and hypothalamus. The thalamus is the gateway for all of our sensory impulses, and we should know that from the previous chapter, where all of the sensory impulses would have to go through the thalamus with one exception, and that is smell. And then from the thalamus, the thalamus would distribute these sensory impulses to the different parts of the cerebral cortex. Now, the hypothalamus, and it's named that because it's underneath the thalamus, so hypothalamus, that is the link between the nervous system and the endocrine system. And in a lot of, some textbooks actually combine both systems together and call them the neuroendocrine system. The hypothalamus is all about homeostasis. So it has a lot of the thermostats, or the control centers for body temperature, salt and water balance, hunger, satiety center, which means that now the person is not hungry, no longer hungry, body weight, movement and glandular secretions in the digestive system, sleep and wakefulness. So again, it has these little centers in order to control, it has a sleep center, and you can turn it on or off. And again, like we said, it has a glandular function, so it does secrete hormones, and those hormones are stored in the posterior pituitary. Now, the limbic system is not really one part in the brain. It's more of a lots of different parts put together, and they have the shared function. And that's why it's called a system, because it's not one part of the brain. It has lots of parts, so it includes parts of the diencephalon, parts of the frontal lobe, and just various parts of the body. It controls really emotional responses and our feelings and behaviors that are really towards survival. So it's more like of the, hunger, being afraid or scared, okay, all of these surviving skills that we need. Okay, so it will react to potential life-threatening conditions, whether these life-threatening conditions are physical or psychological. Now for the brainstem connects the cerebrum on top to the spinal cord on the bottom, and it's made out of the midbrain, the pons, and the medulla oblongata. As the medulla continues downwards, it will become your spinal cord. So the brainstem is the part that is right underneath the diencephalon, and it's above the pons. Okay, it has these centers for visual and auditory reflexes. Those are known as the corpora quadrigemina. So I'll go to the picture to show where they are. So there's two of them. There's these little two white bumps, 1 and 2, and then there's 2 on the opposite side. So that would make 4 corpora quadrigemina. Corpora comes from the corpus or body. Quadri means 4. And those again are centers for visual and auditory reflexes. So think of the blinking reflexes, and there are other reflexes that happen in the ear as well, and especially if we are exposed to very loud noises. And so these reflexes happen in order to protect the ear. The centers for those reflexes are found in the corpora quadrigemina of the midbrain. The midbrain also has a red nucleus, and remember, nucleus means the collection of cell bodies in the CNS, and that they have a role in postural reflexes. So think of that time when somebody tried to push you or knock you down, and you were able to regain your balance. That is part of a postural reflex. So the reflex is in order to maintain posture. The pons, well, above it you have the midbrain, below it you have the medulla oblongata, and that helps in the regulation of the rhythm of breathing. So notice we did not say the rate of breathing. It's the rhythm of breathing that is found, that center is found in the pons. The medulla oblongata, that as it elongates downwards, it becomes the spinal cord. It has tons of impulses going up and down from or to the brain, and it has centers that are vital for life. So there are the cardiac centers, that's for heart rate, vasomotor, those are for your blood vessels, and the respiratory control centers. So those are vital centers, and that's why injuries to the medulla are actually considered fatal injuries. While we also have non-vital reflex control centers, so other things that we do as a reflex, but they are not considered vital signs. For example, coughing, sneezing, swallowing, and vomiting. The reticular formation, these are they're also known as the RAS, or the reticular activating system. And these are a network of fibers that are found that run kind of like down the brainstem. They also extend up into the diencephalon. And these are filters for any incoming sensory information. So remember that all sensory information would have to ascend up to the cerebrum. Remember we said it goes through the thalamus with that one exception. Well, it also goes through this filter. That filter is known as the reticular formation. The reticular formation, when we're awake, okay, it is active. Okay, and it allows for the passage of all of these sensory stimuli to the cerebral cortex. So when we're awake, pretty much these gates are open in the reticular formation. It allows for the passage of the things that we see and hear throughout the day. When we sleep, okay, it decreases its activity. So you see here that the gates are shut. Now, these fibers are also going to shut down when we sleep. That is known as the decreased activity of the reticular formation, and prevent things from reaching the cerebral cortex. So when we're asleep, there is noise around us, or there might be noise around us. There might even be light sometimes, but we sleep through it, and that is due to the function of the reticular formation. If you know a parent that has a newborn baby, they could sleep through maybe a thunderstorm, but if that baby started to cry a little bit, they would wake up. So the reticular formation, not only does it filter out things, it also has the ability to choose which are important sensory stimuli that the person needs to know about when they're asleep and wake them up, and what are not important, and we can just keep on blocking them while the person's sleeping. This reticular formation is also the one that allows that alarm clock, or that sound of the alarm, to get through and wake you up. Talking of sleep, so let's talk a little bit about the types of sleep. So what is sleep? Sleep is a normal, recurring, reversible state of unconsciousness. It is actually part of homeostasis. We need to sleep in order to survive. Lack of sleep, or the deprivation of sleep, is actually considered a type of torture. So sleep, again, is definitely homeostatic. It is as important as drinking and eating and so on. It is part of the things that we need in order to survive. Now, there are two different stages. There is the non-REM, or the non-rapid eye movement sleep. And this is the kind of sleep that, if you're recording the patient's brain activity through what is known as an electroencephalogram or an EEG, they have these very slow waves that show up on their recording. The person here is very tired. There's the decreased activity of reticular formation, remember, in order to shut down the sensory stimuli reaching the brain. It's very restful, but the patient or the person does not dream through this part. This is really the restful kind of sleep. The blood pressure goes down, breathing rates go down. It's made out of 3 different stages. They're known as N1, 2, and 3. And this is where how we initiate sleep. So we go through N1 stage, then N2, and then N3. That whole phase takes about 30 to 45 minutes. And then the person will go into this REM sleep, or rapid eye movement. It is also known as paradoxical sleep, because the activity in the brain, when recorded, looks exactly like the brain activity when the person is alert and thinking. And the heart rates go up, breathing rates go up, blood pressure goes up. This is when dreaming can happen as well. Here you can see now these brain waves that we were talking about, and they're recorded through an EEG, or an electroencephalogram, where we put electrodes on the scalp, and those are going to detect all of the electrical changes that are happening. The 4 types of waves that we want to be familiar with. The alpha waves, those are the waves that occur if you're awake and resting with your eyes closed. Okay, so these are one of the first waves, not only that happen when we're resting while awake, but these are the waves that happen as we start to get into sleep. So during that drowsy phase, when we're still in between full alertness and falling asleep. Okay, so alpha waves, again, awake with resting with your eyes closed. And these are what they look like. You're not going to get a strip of EEG graph and asked what kind of waves are you looking at, but you do have to know what these waves stand for. Now, the beta waves, these are the waves that we get when we're fully alert and thinking. So these are the waves that you have right now. If you were being recorded, trying to listen to this lecture, your brain would be making these beta waves. And again, these are the waves that come out during REM sleep. Theta waves, these are what usually happen in kids. There's lots of stuff being done in the brains. They're processing, they're active. So these are the theta waves that children would be making. And then these delta waves that are, bigger in amplitude, those are made mainly while we're asleep. Now, some sleep disorders, and I kind of circled the ones that are more common. So insomnia, that is the inability to fall or to remain asleep. You can see here that about 10% of the population actually has that. So it is it's considered a common sleep disorder. We also have obstructive sleep apnea syndrome. So if you've ever had a sleep study done, or maybe you know somebody that has, this is what they're looking for. Sleep apnea means that the person stops breathing during sleep due to obstruction. That obstruction could be maybe due to adenoids or due to the collapse of the pharynx during sleep due to muscle weakness. So there's an upper airway collapse that happens repeatedly during sleep. It'll block the breathing, and the patient or the person would be snoring throughout the night, and they would feel drowsy in the morning. So they really did not have that very restful sleep. And again, they feel like they really have not slept at all. They wake up in the morning very tired, and that's about 4 to 5% of the population. So that is also a good number of people. Parasomnias, and these are things that happen in conjunction with sleeping. So sleepwalking, sleep talking, and night terrors. So sleepwalking and sleep talking, those are pretty self-explanatory. Night terrors means that this usually happens more in kids, where the child wakes up and their eyes are actually open, they are screaming, they're scared, and they look terrified, hence the name night terrors. But no matter how much you try to talk to them or how much you try to calm them down, they're actually asleep, so they are not going to be responding to you whatsoever. They're harmless. They will eventually go back to sleep on their own. Restless leg syndrome, this happens to about 5% of the population. Okay, so again, it's another common disease where the patient has brief, repetitive leg jerks during sleep. So the person is asleep, but their legs are also always it's like the patient is kicking their legs throughout the night. The patient wakes up, and if their partner wakes up. So it's very frustrating, not only for the patient, but for the person sleeping with them as well, because of these leg jerks repeatedly wakes them up as well throughout the night. Now, the cerebellum is the little tiny brain-looking structure that is found underneath the cerebrum, and we have a right and a left lobe as well. There is a flap of dura separating the two cerebellar hemispheres, and that is known as the falx cerebelli. When you look at the section, it kind of looks like a tree, and that tree is known as the arbor vitae. That is the white matter. The cerebellum is responsible for maintaining posture, and also for coordination of skeletal muscle activity, meaning that when am I going to contract this muscle and when am I going to relax them, or which one is going to contract and which one is relaxing. So the coordination of your skeletal muscles and posture maintenance is the function of the cerebellum. It also integrates sensory information concerning body parts. So not all sensory information. So it has nothing to do with, say, touch and pressure. It is concerned about the body position parts, or the position of your body parts, meaning that the muscles, the tendons, or ligaments are all sending information to the brain on where they are. Is the muscle contracted or relaxed? Our joints, are they flexed or extended? All of that information is known as proprioception. Now, these all of that proprioceptive information has to go through the cerebellum in order to help coordinate our skeletal muscle activity and maintain your posture. Okay, so again, it gets proprioceptive information from the body in order to help coordinate skeletal muscle activity and maintain posture. Hey, so I've got this on here to show the importance of sleep and the relationship between, how we consolidate short-term memory into long-term memory. Consider sleep an extension of studying. So whatever you study throughout the day, any experiences or skills you develop throughout the day are going to be consolidated in your head through your sleep. Okay, so I'm just going to go to sleep and not study. That's not how this works. Okay, you actually have to expose yourself to these experiences and then sleep. And that's when all of these little pieces are going to fit in your head and consolidate them into long-term memories. At this point, I'm going to end this portion and I will see you in the next.